So now it's the old cliche of introducing the person that needs no introduction. Richard Campanella will be speaking next, geographer and senior professor at Tulane School of Architecture. Richard Campanella is the author of 10 books and over 200 other publications on New Orleans and Louisiana geography, history, architecture, urbanism, culture, and related topics. The only two-time winner of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities Book of the Year Award, Campanella has also received the Louisiana Literary Award, the Historic New Orleans Collection's Williams Prize for Louisiana History, and numerous other awards for his teaching and research. In 2016, France named Campanella a knight in the prestigious Order of the Academic Palms. And also, if you follow him on Twitter, which you should do if you don't, and you see the photos that he posts, new and old, you know how good he is at getting us to see the city we live in new ways, to think about the spaces through which earlier residents worked and played and shopped, and according to our last panel, also drank. So please join me in welcoming Richard Campanella.
Thanks very much, Molly. Thank you for the introduction, for the invitation, for coming out today. We're going to be talking about human geography today, and I want to give a real kudos to the organizers, Emily, Priscilla, and others, for making this symposium geographical and spatial. You may have noticed 2 days ago you were in a neighborhood developed in the 18th century on higher ground closer to the river. Yesterday we were in a lower-lying neighborhood developed in the 19th century. Today you are in a 20th century neighborhood that was built on sediment pumped in from the bottom of Lake Pontchartrain. And you may have noticed that the demographics of those three neighborhoods also differed. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Ethnic geography, ethnic race, and class patterns. Humans do not evenly nor randomly distribute themselves across the cityscape. Those with more power gravitate to areas of lower risk and greater opportunity. Those in opposite conditions often get relegated elsewhere. Therefore, residential settlement patterns have social meaning, and interpreting them enriches our understanding of history. Before we could do this, we have to understand the underlying physical geography. So if you bear with me, let me give a 20,000 years in 20 seconds geography of our region. If you were here as recently as 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, very recently geologically, you would be in the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, roughly like Lake Pontchartrain waters. 10,000 years prior, global temperatures are warming, the ice sheets are melting, and coming down the Mississippi River Valley is this conveyor belt of sediment-laden water. It hits this slack water body, it loses its kinetic energy and starts dumping out all of the sand, silt, and clay at the edge of the continent, to the point that that accumulation breaks the surface, starts to transform salt water into salt marsh, into freshwater swamp, into something resembling land, to the point that the river could no longer go through its own deposition. And so it leans over to the side. These are called avulsions, when the river jumps channels. And it's at this moment, maybe there's differing chronologies here, maybe 4,000 years ago, that the river lunges in this direction and starts to build future New Orleans. A couple of other river channel jumps. This is our current channel. So what I'm describing right here accounts for the building of probably 2/3 of the deltaic plain. The rest of it comes for more frequent events of river overtopping. You may have noticed the spillway was open a couple of days ago. We have very high water on the river. Under natural conditions, if you look at that red transect, here's the channel here. Under natural conditions, high water would simply spread that excess water laterally, as rivers tend to do, and go down a few months later, maybe 3 or 5 years later, same thing. So the effect that this has, relevant to human geography, is that the largest quantities of the coarsest sediment particles, which are going to be silt and sand because they're heavier, fall out immediately. Smaller quantities of the finest particles, clay particles, settle out in smaller amounts farther back. So you repeat this over and over, and you get this peculiarity of alluvial and deltaic regions of the areas closest to the river rising the highest. The exact opposite that you would see in most other portions of the earth where water carves down. So when we start, we call these natural levees, lever from to raise up, the back slope of the natural levee, and then the back swamp as you get farther back. Now, with the European arrival here, Native Americans lived conditionally with this flux. High waters came, they moved to higher ground, they built up coastal middens, they made their own topography, or they moved to higher areas. But imperialism entails permanency. Permanency cannot tolerate that sort of fluidity. And so rigidity was imposed through engineering on this fluidity in the form, first and foremost, of artificial levees. So this drastically brings down the number of times that water comes on the deltaic plain, and it starts to create social spaces. These areas, as we will see today, that were closest to the river, now you would think that those would be the highest. Shouldn't we be seeing mansions along Chapatula Street? It's the highest around. But in fact, it's a working riverfront. And so those areas immediately along the riverfront tended to form working class settlements. It's in that farther back, just farther back, but still on the natural levee, that is kind of the sweet spot that is just far enough from the nuisances and the grit of the working riverfront, but also far enough from the environmental risk and the flood-prone back swamp. And so we have this front of town, back of town phenomena, and so more empowered peoples tend to gravitate there. The opposite is the case for these so-called back of town spaces on the lower ground. So this is pretty consistent through the first 2 centuries of the city's historical geography. It completely, radically, I wouldn't say reverses, but changes in the 20th century. More on that later. Now, everything here we're looking at vertical space, okay? Now we're going to switch to horizontal space, and there are some drivers there. In the era before mechanized transportation, the first rail line, 1831, first streetcar, 1835, horizontal space mattered. Walking long distances on muddy streets was onerous. The prestige, the power, the amenity, the C and B scene, it was in the urban core. And so being not just in the front of town, but closer to the urban core is where you wanted to be if you had the wherewithal. The opposite was the case as you got farther out. Once again, this would change as streetcars develop, but we see an urban core versus periphery as well as a front of town, back of town pattern. So let's start bringing humans into this, and I'm going to, in the interest of time, get right to when patterns really start to get complicated in the early 19th century after Americanization. What you're looking at here, and that's small for a reason I'm going to show in a moment, is the red dots here, and methodology matters here when you map people in the aggregate. Data sources are few and far between. The census is very frustrating because the enumerators were pretty sloppy about spatializing each of the entries in the population schedules. They wrote down addresses very, very kind of loosey-goosey. And so the census is not really useful until further on in the 19th century. So you have to look for other sources. And this one here, this is 1808. It's a property map. And using this technique of surname interpretation, I went through each of the property owners and very grossly kind of categorize them if they had more likely to be French-sounding, Francophone-sounding, or Spanish-sounding names. I went ahead with a little bit of license and called that they were probably Creoles, native-born. Now, they might have been some foreign French, et cetera. They might have been some immigrants. But the red dots are those with French-sounding, bourgeois, Villery, et cetera, names, and there's some little red triangles of Castellanos, Caballeros, Spanish-sounding names. The blue dots there are those with very clearly Anglo names of Smith and very, very straightforward that they're more likely to be Anglophones. So what you see here, you could find a blue or a red dot anywhere. So technically, you could say that people, these different ethnic groups live anywhere. But notice that little predomination on the upriver side here. Canal Street is not yet in place. That's 1810. Now, there is a subdivision in the present-day CBD, but there was no data for that. So notice the preponderance of blue dots at the edge there. This would be what is now Iberville Street, Bienville Street. So what you're seeing is the very beginning of this all-important ethnic geographical pattern of a more Creole, more Francophone, more Catholic, more Old World-oriented French Quarter, Treme, lower Faubourg, Creole Faubourgs, and an increasingly more Anglo upper one. Now I'm going to fast forward. Why this pattern? Well, for one thing, the neighborhood over here, present-day CBD, was already laid out. That was laid out in 1788. It was already urbanized, although low population. That's the only main suburb by the time of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, sure enough, Marigny is laid out in 1805, an edge of Bywater in 1807, Treme in 1810, but that is developable space. So if they didn't want to live with their French neighbor, that's the one place they're going to go. It also so happens that the natural levee is wider there, and also, very important, this is a riverine city. Water, your water source is the river. It's the highest population that's going to be dumping waste and detritus into this river. If you have the wherewithal to live upriver from that, that's a good thing to take advantage of, okay? And so there is a preponderance. This is a pretty well-educated, ambitious group coming down here. They're looking at commerce. And they don't want to live with these different folks, and so upriver is the natural place for them to settle. Now, fast forward a whole generation here. This is 1842. The data source here is city directories. They are problematic. Not everyone was listed in the city directories. They tended to over-report the upper half of society. But again, when you have problems with the other data sources, you got to do the best you can with the data that are available. So I went through once again looking at every 1,700 different surnames. Those with more likely to be French and Spanish surnames, which would have included some immigrants, but they're in red here, and you'll see they're very much as a cluster in the quarter. They outnumber Anglos by about a 3-to-1 ratio. Now, same data set, same methodology. The next map I'm going to show you is Anglo names. Now watch what happens. Okay? You see that preponderance shifting to the upriver direction? Now, if these were really comprehensive data sets, I would predict you'd see a whole lot more red dots over here and more of an upriver shift here. That 3-to-1 ratio might be more to 5-to-1. In each side of Canal Street. But also notice that Canal Street is not the Rubicon, the hard dividing line that we often hear in legend, that a Creole would never step above it and an Anglo would never step below it. Rather, there were preponderances. Where that Canal Street story comes from was from a heavy-handed imposition of political geography on top of this ethnic geography. These groups were rivals. They did things differently, they lived separately, and they didn't get along. And as early as the 1820s, the Creole population is pining for the state to intervene and go ahead, just chop up New Orleans into separate cities. The Anglos eventually succeed. The Anglos get the blame for this, for actually making it happen in 1836. But really, both sides were looking to political geography to solve the fact that they didn't get along. And so what the state did in 1836 was subdivide the city into 3 semi-autonomous municipalities, each with their own council, their own police force, their own port management, their own schools, and they did so along ethnic lines. So the more Creole first municipality, Treme in the French Quarter, was its own. The second municipality was mostly Anglo. The third was mostly Creole as well as immigrant. And then Lafayette, which was a separate city, as you'll see in a moment, eventually gets subsumed into New Orleans. The system was unique in the nation. It was redundant. It was wasteful. It was almost brilliantly stupid. In that it aimed to solve a problem and it made it only worse. Now they were explicitly in competition with each other to try to land investments on their side of town. So it really worsened the matter. And it wreaked havoc on the city's bond rating, and it really couldn't continue. The reason why it ended in 1852, however, was that, first of all, more and more Anglos are coming down. They're establishing political alliances with the Irish and German. Lafayette over here has lots of Irish and German by the river, many Anglos in what is now the Garden District. So in the same day that the state did away and reunified the 3 municipalities, it also annexed in Lafayette, and that is the moment when demographically the Anglo cohort started to win elections. And the cultural fulcrum of New Orleans' future starts to shift increasingly away from the old Creole population and more toward the American population. Let's look at a little bit now of the ethnic geography and racial geography of those of African ancestry. And I'm going to divide this between the enslaved population and the free people of color population. And what we see in New Orleans is something that scholars have also documented in other enslaved large cities: Baltimore, Washington, Charleston. It's one, scholars called it the back alley pattern of this ironic spatial integration, a heterogeneous pattern driven by the exigencies of urban slavery. And this manifests itself in what some people call servants' quarters, other people call slave quarters. So what you're seeing here is a benefit to the master of both convenience and control to have the enslaved population lodged in immediate adjacency. They didn't really need any encouragement for this, but they got it anyway in the form of an 1817 ordinance that mandated that enslaved be located lodged on properties owned by the master. And of course, that's most conveniently going to be on their same property. And so you see these distinctive slant-roofed appendages and dependencies adjoining everything from townhouses to surprisingly modest Creole cottages in some cases. You see this ad nauseum in real estate ads. If you notice this one over here, Casa Calvo in Marigny, that is now Royal Street in Marigny. And you notice that last line here. It's almost an enslaved apartment house, a large frame house on the adjoining spatial adjacency lot calculated to lodge 200. Here's another one here on Bourbon and St. Peter, Negro cabins for each apartment, again, that immediate adjacency. This is from a WPA interview 100 years later. Built, our quarters are small, built in the backyard of master's home. So there's a remarkable 1843 Picayune article that, in the language of the day, tracks and describes very loosely some of these ethnic settlement patterns. So I'll share with you one line there. You'll notice here the Negroes are scattered through the city promiscuously. What that is implying is that spatial heterogeneity of black-white proximity. Notice the next lines now when the topic shifts over to the free people of color. Mixed blood, grifts, quadroons, again the language of the day, showing a preference for the back streets of the first and part of the third municipality. What is that a reference to? Well, there's the first and there's the third. They're out of numerical order, but it's the lower side of the city that was more Creole. These folks were Creole in their ethnicity. They were deep-rooted. They were Francophone. They were born here. They were Catholic. They felt more comfortable in multitudes of ways on that side of town as opposed to Anglo. Let's see if there's some empirical validation of this. This is the 1860 census. You look at the French Quarter in the middle here. The size of the pie chart is the total population of the wards. The green is the free people of color. The red is the enslaved. And, you know, you originally see this just in a little table from an ancient census. But when you map it out, I was really just flabbergasted of just how perfectly linear this pattern was. So when you go from the French Quarter into the more Creole side of town, it's roughly 50-50 here. In places in Marigny and what we now call Bywater, free people of color are outnumbering slave by a 3-to-1 ratio. These are mostly free people of African ancestry neighborhoods. When you go in the opposite direction here, in the more Anglo side of town, the ratio reverses, where you see, now granted there's smaller populations of people of African ancestry, but they're mostly enslaved. So it very much validates and also partially explains that many of this incoming Anglo cohort came from parts of the nation where the very notion that there is such a thing as a free person of color is alien and an affront to them. And so you see that less in the areas where they lived. Now let's look at the back street reference. What's going on here? Well, this is that front of town, back of town pattern. What you're looking here, I'll show you in a moment, is the 1820 census, and we're just looking at the quarter here from what is now Decatur, Charters, Royal, Bourbon, Dauphin, going front of town to back of town. So we'll lay that out over here, and at first we'll look at the enslaved population per each of those streets. Look at those numbers there. Pretty much flat across the board, validating this intermixed heterogeneity. But when we look at just the free people of color, look at the pattern. Very low in the front of town. Now watch what happens. Okay? And we saw this yesterday with the presentation of the Dolil family. They weren't on charters. They weren't on Royal. They were on Burgundy. They were across Rampart Street. So let's talk about immigration and put some spaces and maps on the information you heard in the previous panel. I struggled long and hard to make this graph because the data come in something other than an apples-to-apples way. Louisiana Purchase over here, Civil War over here. Some of these are based on manifests, others are on census reports. I couldn't quite make it comprehensive, but here's the Haitian exiles over here. The two major groups that we'll talk about right now are Irish and German. Notice how just astronomical those peaks are. Now, to be sure, you could pull down on those peaks a little bit, maybe 10%, because those manifests record who arrived here, but not necessarily who stayed here. Nevertheless, no question that Irish and German were the two biggest groups, and they encountered an urban geography that, to reference what I was saying earlier, of a core periphery pattern. What was going on in the core, that's where the action was, that's where the prestige was. You didn't want to live in the suburbs in that time. The suburbs were kind of semi-rural periphery. That's where all the industries that could not be in the city proper, but needed to be close to the metropolis, tended to be built. So we're talking like stinky, nuisance-emitting tanneries, boiling, rendering animal parts, soap factories, sawmills, noise, smoke, riverfront, the flatboat wharf, which was odious on a number of levels. You have livestock coming in, marching through the streets, muddy ditch digging, canal excavation projects. So wealthy people didn't want to live next to those things, but for incoming immigration groups, these were an abundant, low-skilled employment opportunities. Even more so, low-density housing there, cheap living, small common wall cottages with space in the back where you could raise vegetables, help feed your family. If you had surplus, known as truck, hence truck farms, you could sell that in the local market. And so these two groups in particular exhibit this periphery pattern. This is through surname interpretation. I'm looking for Kellys and capital M small c and O apostrophes. And so what you're seeing here is not that many Irish in the French Quarter, not that many in the urban core. In fact, it's more of a peripheral settlement pattern. And all you have to do, just like Laura said, is look at where the churches are today, and they mark the spot. So what areas are we talking about? Of course, the Irish Channel, the riverfront, also the rear of parts of what we call now a central city. There was a canal there known as the Gormley Canal that also provided, as loathsome as it was as a mud hole and a fetid sort of disease-rendering place, it brought in timber. There were jobs along there. The New Basin Canal, also on the Marigny side, less so in the urban core. So with the churches there, the Archdiocese is essentially looking where its potential congregants are settling, and they go ahead and find a way to put a church there. There's other groups where the pattern is the opposite. The German, as Daniel pointed out, arrive at roughly the same time. The 48ers, the German livers, they tend to be better educated, they tend to be professionally skilled, but they have a barrier that the Irish don't have, and that is language. And so they settle into a remarkable degree to very similar residential settlement patterns as the Irish. Now, surname interpretation did not work for this group. I tried it, but there was too much blurring of lines between a Germanic name of an immigrant and an Anglo-Saxon name. So I gave up with that, instead mapped out institutions here, and a big one in the Lafayette riverfront, again, where the Irish Channel is, and Carrollton over here. Also these back of town areas, but probably most prominently the Marigny area that gained the nickname of Little Saxony. These were Catholic as well as Protestant as well as Jewish. Down the bottom right there is the oldest surviving German Jewish synagogue in the city. It's now apartments. St. Paul's Lutheran. Now this one, Old Holy Trinity, now also deconsecrated, is a dead ringer for a Bavarian-style church, and there's a reason for that. What's the Catholic region of Germany? And so though that particular area got the nickname of Little Saxony, you're looking at 1880 census here. Those pie charts are at the enumeration district level. The red is German immigrants born in Germany. The blue are their locally born children. So if you take a look there, we're not talking majorities. Sometimes we're talking pluralities. And so the point I want to make here when antebellum times is that we're not really seeing extreme exclusive ethnic clusters. We're looking more of greater and lesser concentrations. I use the analogy of, think of like on a very dark night with clear skies, you look up and you see the Milky Way galaxy. You don't necessarily see a vast area with 0 stars, nor do you see extreme, huge galaxies and clusters. What you see is a series of greater and lesser concentrations, and those are those peripheral patterns. So for antebellum, the Creoles, lower city, Anglo, upper city, urban core tended to be wealthier, although also quite a bit mixed, but preponderance of wealth. The periphery had those jobs. It also had the nuisances, that's where the immigrants settled. Immigrants in smaller numbers, you notice some of those lower graphs, are also coming in. Okay. I don't see there's a little, all right, get out of here. Back to the 19th century. Immigrants are coming in from Spain, from Italy, as Justin mentioned, from Sicily, from Mexico, from Cuba. They overwhelmingly choose the Creole side of town. It's more Catholic. This is the era of the Know-Nothing movement. They don't necessarily feel that comfortable living uptown. And so they tend to iterate the patterns of the Creoles. Free people of color, as we mentioned, also in that area, and enslaved, more spatially integrated, and I put integrated in quotes there, given the irony. Postbellum era, the African-American population dramatically rises, goes from like 15% to 25%. It almost doubles in terms of absolute numbers. Who are these folks? They are people almost like a mini Great Migration, moving away from the desperation of the plantation to the hope of the city. They're coming to New Orleans. This is also the era when the streetcar system starts to expand out in those very areas that used to be low-skilled work opportunities, and those back of town and those peripheral industries are now starting to become garden suburbs, called the streetcar suburbs in other cities. Grids are being laid out. They're becoming increasingly populated. The wealthy who used to be in the urban core are moving out to these areas, and what do they leave behind in the urban core but these big, spacious mansions? Just walk down Charters and Royal Street that could be cribbed or subdivided into small tenements. And who are they going to rent to? They're going to rent to that next generation of immigrants coming in. Where are they coming from? Not so much Ireland and Germanic Europe. It's a shift toward Latin Europe and to Slavic Europe, to Mediterranean Europe, as well as to the Caribbean. Where are they going to settle? They're settling, as you'll see, much closer to the urban core in a belt, kind of an annulus, that I've termed the Immigrant Belt. So here we are on our graph here. You'll notice the lower numbers. Those Germans coming in 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, most of those move on. So notice the Sicilians there, and smaller numbers, but larger number of groups: Chinese, Slavic, Croatians, Greek, Russian, Romanian, Polish. And so let's start to map out their patterns. Justin mentioned the Sicilians and that early antebellum population, which was quite prominent. But the lion's share coming in later in the 19th century and turn of the 20th century are being specifically recruited by sugar planters and cotton in association with the state to essentially replace enslaved people on the plantations. They realize they're in that caste. They don't want to be there. And so by the early 1900s, many of them urbanize. And where do they settle? Again, you're looking at 1937, 1940 here. Those yellow dots are the Italian population at that time. Notice the preponderance, not just in the French Quarter and adjacent areas, but particularly the lower French Quarter. Went to the 1938 directory looking for Italian and Sicilian names, and you see very much that lower quarter there. Why there? One of the main drivers was the French market. And you see this over and over again, the role of municipal markets in driving particularly immigrant settlement patterns. Low cost, low capital, easy entry to owning your own business, controlling your own destiny. The language barrier didn't matter. You could figure out a pidgin language to get, but you were selling to your brethren anyway. So the French market was a major driver here. This is also the era before zoning. And so, as Justin could attest to, there were little macaroni factories. There were light kind of food processing all over the French Quarter. And at this same era, also initially recruited in to replace the enslaved as well as the Bill Railroads, were Hispanicized Chinese out of Cuba, which had previously, in the Caribbean dealing with emancipation, looked to bring in East Asians and South Asians. So they started recruiting directly from Cuba, then California, then Hong Kong, and a Chinatown formed as they moved away from those rural conditions and moved into New Orleans. Here we had a little tiny but very well-known Chinatown. Louis Armstrong wrote about it. But there was a driver, just as there was a reason for Sicilians to move out of Little Palermo, which was the nickname, and spread around the city. The niche, the economic niche there, was the famous Sicilian corner grocery. If you're starting a grocery store, you have two spatial drivers driving you to move into certain areas. You don't want to be too close to your uncle or aunt who's doing the same thing, but you want to be maximally convenient to your clients. And so what that means, spread out, don't cluster. For the Chinese, what's the equivalent there? What's the niche? Chinese laundry. You're looking at them mapped out in yellow there, and so that had the effect. You all remember Harry Lee. Harry Lee was born in the back of his family's Chinese laundry, and it was not in Chinatown. There was a tiny Greek enclave here, traceable. I like to think of that as not a Greek revival building, but really a Greek building. Built in 1866 on donated land. This is one of those cases where, with the smaller groups, that instead of the ethnic geography forming and then the church getting located in the middle of it, it was the opposite. The church got located due to a real estate donation, and the people moved around it. And so there was many of Orthodox religions. This is around 1220 Durgeois Street here. The comment was made yesterday that we didn't have much of an Orthodox Jewish population here. In comparison to New York and others, it was much smaller, but it was enough to form a neighborhood. And the settlement there was in the area between St. Charles and Dryades Street, just kind of upriver from Howard Avenue. And one of the major drivers there was, once again, the old Dryades Market. There was a direct rail line, streetcar line, connecting it with the Poydras Market. Again, easy entry to owning your own business, and laid the groundwork for this mostly Polish, Romanian, Russian population to starting their own businesses along Dryades Street. And 50 and 100 years ago, every New Orleanian referred to New Dryades Street as, quote, the Jewish neighborhood. So those are the shops along Dryades Street. Now, the technique for mapping out this group is actually quite convenient, and that is the tradition, not recognized by the Reformed community, but more by the Orthodox, of walking to synagogue on the Sabbath. So if you map the synagogues, you can't live too far from them. And so that's what you're seeing here in the red dots. So if we try to bring rhyme and reason to these patterns here, if you look at that top map there, what I'm mapping out is that core periphery pattern and the front of town, back of town, the topographical patterns. And so what we're finding here is, you probably can't see that, but most of these postbellum turn of the century enclaves are all forming in that ring immediately hugging the urban core. You're seeing this in New York City. You're seeing this in San Francisco. Where is the Little Italy and the Chinatown in both of their cities? They're within walking distance of the absolute financial core of the city. This has also been recognized in places. This is Ernest Burgess' work of Chicago in the 1920s. He called it the concentric zone model. Central business district, see that working class zone, transitional zone? That's what is mapping out to being that immigrant settlement pattern in New Orleans, formed, twisted, and kind of squeezed to the unusual natural levee geography of a deltaic city. So if we plot this over an aerial photo from that era, there's the urban core, there's Little Palermo, there's Chinatown, you see the pattern here, there's the Jewish enclave, the Greek one over here, the older Irish and German ones. Now let's talk about the back of town and African-American settlement in this era. By back of town, you just take a look at these photos, this is what we mean. Front of town over here. Notice how urbanization just peters out over here. Over here, here's Charity Hospital. Would you want to live next to this? Okay, that's the gas plant over here. Notice how the urban texture of buildings changes over here. You know what this is right here? That's the Orleans Parish Prison, right next to the police station, strategically located to be able to, have reconnaissance into this area. So 1910 here, we're looking at the racial geography of the city there. The yellow dots are African American. Notice that front of town, back of town pattern over here. These areas a little bit up on a ridge, you see more white population there. But notice these empty areas over here. This is the era when geographically everything starts to change, and it does so in large part because of the drainage system. The pumps are installed, designed 1893, Sewage and Water Board 1899, and finally that so-called problem of the back swamp is drained away, and the impacts of this are draconian. So we used to live on the higher ground in the 1700s there, 1800s here. The next map is the 1910 census. The water table is lowering. The swamps are drying out. They're becoming developable land. Watch what happens. You see that? Okay. Moving off the natural levee, here's 1930s. The industrial canal is now in place. Moving into those former low-lying areas that are now garden, they're California-style suburbs. And what are they building? They're building California bungalows. In fact, some of these areas were explicitly marketed as, quote, Little California. So back to our 1910 racial geography here. The blue dots are African American, the yellow white. Notice this area is just kind of off the map here. I'm going to overlay this with 1939. You see that change there? Okay. Again, 1910, 1939. What happened in between? Well, one thing was drainage, but another one was the full manifestation of de jure Jim Crow segregation. And you'll notice over here, there's quite a percent African American per block here. So the white blocks are more over here. But notice the huge number of integrated blocks here. This was brought up earlier by Bruce and others of these integrated neighborhoods with these folks from different groups living right next to each other. But now notice these three neighborhoods here, as well as parts of Fontainebleau and Broadmoor, that are 0%. So what's going on here is this leapfrogging of the white middle class eager to get out of these crumbling old 19th century neighborhoods to modernity, to these neighborhoods over here. And so as that's happening, the once heterogeneous racial geography, where you might not be going to the same school as your black neighbor or to the same restaurant as your white neighbor, but you live right next to each other, starts to racially, spatially disassociate, to pull apart. So what's going on here is that the segregation laws in effect at that time found a perfect place for them to manifest themselves in these newly opened up spaces of the lakefront. What's going on nationally, this is the era when American cities are getting really complicated. You have all these ordinances try to prevent lawsuits of what you could do in certain neighborhoods. So the solution is zoning, which, what does zoning do? It segregates land use. This is an industrial zone, this is residential, this is commercial. In the South, officials viewed African American neighborhoods as something that affected property values and therefore should be zoned. And so attempts were made to start racial zoning ordinances. Louisville was one of the first. It goes to the Supreme Court, and it's actually turned down. It's declared, even in this environment, that atmosphere at the time, Supreme Court found, in this case Buchanan versus Worley, that officially racially segregated neighborhoods were flat out unconstitutional. But the South has a tradition of ignoring Supreme Court rulings. And so in New Orleans, we have the first major city in the South with the same city planning and zoning commission we have today. And the very next year, Louisiana takes it upon itself, the legislature, to mandate cities over 25,000 would have to racially segregate their neighborhoods. That's within a month or so, the New Orleans Planning Commission eagerly complies and starts, they don't actually create maps, but they're heading in that direction to create a racial zoning ordinance. A case opens up just above Audubon Park, is actually on Audubon Street, Harmon versus Tyler. And it's hard to tell if this is a test case or a real case that then got a lot of attention because it would test this, but this goes to the Supreme Court, and once again, the Supreme Court says you cannot do this. We cannot justify this. And so what the city and real estate authorities do is figure out this kind of clever way around it, to give up with the legal route to do this and move it over to civic bodies in the real estate industry. And here's a remarkable article right in the aftermath of Harmon versus Tyler. I'll read it to you. Segregation can be achieved in New Orleans without any specific law on the subject. The city ordinance has been declared unconstitutional, but its purpose may be as effectively served by the simple expedient of writing into acts of sale the stipulation that the property shall not be transferred to white or colored persons as the particular location may demand. Real estate, these two brothers, the Moran brothers, real estate agents of considerable experience contribute a plan which they claim would be entirely practical and provide the results sought without invoking further legislation. So their plan here is that everyone involved in a transaction pledges not to participate in any transaction in which either white or colored would attempt to obtain residence in any section reserved for the opposite race. The real estate man would decline to sell or lease, the lawyer to examine title, the notary to pass the acts, the insurance man to protect, redlining, right? The architect to design or remodel, and the homestead to grant loans where any such invasion would be intended. The outcome would guarantee that both races in New Orleans would continue to reside here in peace and tranquility. So the main mechanism here is the racist deed covenant, where it's explicitly written. Now, this is not unique to New Orleans. You see this example is from Houston. You see this even in Levittown in New York, that none of the lots shall be owned or occupied by any other person other than the Caucasian race. This also manifests itself in redlining. And some of you may be familiar with these HOLC maps from the New Deal. They're little. It's hard to see exactly the impact these had. There was one study from University of Pennsylvania that found that the areas defined as hazardous here and definitely declining actually got more loans for houses, but they had, because there was more need there, but they also had higher interest rates. But the point here is that of government authorities drawing lines around certain neighborhoods and destining them for divestment or investment based on some factors, one of which was their racial occupancy. Here's another example of public schools. This is a remarkable document right after World War II, 1950, when there's a baby boom. And the Orleans Parish School Board is grappling of where to create new districts to fit all these incoming children. So they map out all the white children in that map there and African-American children here. And you could just see, even with these washed out slides, the much higher density on the right there. So they devise school districts for each of the races there. And they notice how the ones for the African-American kids are more concentrated. And they actually named that area, Area 6, the back of town. And notice here the largest Negro concentration in the city, inadequate to accommodate the children, obsolete and unsanitary. The area is so congested that it's difficult to define districts, so they'll just have to share a single district. So in this way, these historical patterns were reified and hardened also through public housing. Even the cover, the back cover and the front cover of that document was segregated. Notice the black children on the back cover and the front white children. So there's 1939, just to describe some of these patterns, that red encircled area there. That is the older, shall we call them Franco-African American, the black Creole community. This is the more likely to be Anglo-African American community, the emancipated peoples coming after the Civil War. Notice that there's more integration in the older ones than there is in the central city area. Those little pockets over there, that's the working class riverfront. You had mixed populations. They were working. They needed to live right next to the river because ships came in at all times of the day and night. These little patterns here that's been described as the superblock nuclei pattern, where you had grand townhouses built along the avenues, more humble housing stock at lower cost in the core of those superblocks. Superblocks, Napoleon, Louisiana State, Calhoun, St. Charles Magazine, and then you have those smaller blocks in between. That was a more affordable for mixed residential settlement pattern, also convenient walking distance to the job opportunities as domestics along the grand avenues. That's Dillard University over there. You'll also see Xavier over there. 61 years later, same color scheme. Watch what happens. This is the year 2000, okay? Notice that difference here. I'm going to draw your eyes to a couple of things. Remember that racial spatial disassociation? Notice where what used to be integrated neighborhoods now has a hard line along St. Claude Avenue. More likely to be white on one side, black on the other. Much more likely. Same thing along St. Charles Avenue. And notice here, you know, why was it that, now both Gentilly and Lakeview had these deed covenants. You saw that 1939 map. So why is it that African American moved mostly into Gentilly and later New Orleans East as opposed to moving west? I think a couple of the patterns here, for one thing, to begin with, they were more proximate to the middle class and upper middle class African American neighborhood to begin with, so it wasn't that far away. Dillard also planted a seed, and then, of course, there was Pontchartrain Park. So once those deed covenants became illegal, this was a more convenient and also a kind of an established area where African-American middle class would feel more at home. Lakeview, on the other hand, was more distant in each regard. So later on, when New Orleans East starts to develop, that area is mostly white in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That proximity and changing settlement patterns makes it mostly African-American a little bit later. So 1910 here, 1939, 1950, watch what happens here. Increasingly, by 2000, a predominantly eastern half of the metropolis that is African American, with plenty of exceptions. Western half more white. So just to catch up on immigrant patterns, Hispanic immigrants coming in, where are they settling? This is a national trend. They're not settling in the old immigrant core or in downtown. They're mostly in the suburbs, Fat City over here in Kenner. Vietnamese also finding more opportunity and lower cost of living in suburban areas. So that old immigrant belt has now kind of like put in a centrifuge and moving outward. So these are some of the most diverse areas here. So if you want to see real linguistic and ethnic and immigrant diversity, don't go to Marigny, don't go to Treme, go to Tarrytown, go to Fat City, go to Kenner. That's where you see today what you used to see in the urban core 100 years ago. Now, to catch up with the Delta, what has happened by this time, you all know the story. Levees along the river starved the plain of silt and fresh water. Canals and oil and gas extraction canals, a rising sea, everything in red lost in one human lifetime. The drainage system starved our swamps of water. They fell below sea level. The bowl condition happened even as people are moving into those areas. New Orleanians used to live 100% above sea level. The entire city was above sea level. It started sinking due to human action, and by 1960, we were 50-50. Half of us living above sea level, half below. By 2000, by 2005, it was more like two-thirds, close to two-thirds below sea level and one-third above. And so when Katrina happened, the water settled in these low-lying areas, but it also more affected the eastern half of the metropolis than the western half. Here's 5 years before and after Katrina, total population. There's the flood footprint. Keep your eyes on the east. There's the flood footprint. Now watch how those red patterns disappear. You see that there? Let me do it again. Now here's the white population over here. Keep your eyes on St. Bernard. Drastically goes down. This is the black population. The Hispanic population increases, but again, notice it's mostly in the suburban periphery, and the same thing to a lesser extent in the Asian Vietnamese population. I'm going to conclude by just zooming in a bit more on 2000 in the heart of the city here. You'll see the legend there. The white population is more in the yellow colors. The rest is more African American. Now I'm going to overlay this, the 2010 census, which of course is already 8 years old. Now watch what happens. See that difference there? So what's going on here is a number of things, one of which is the cachet and appeal that the post-alluvial city has had to many moneyed outsiders coming in from New York. They're finding beauty and appeal in the historic part of the city and doing great things there in remarkable parallel to 200 years ago when transplants came down from the Northeast. And locals, Creoles at the time, native-born people here, not knowing what to make of them, seeing them as increasingly appropriating local culture, moving into neighborhoods, doing great things in restoring architecture and bringing back a new revived spirit in these areas. But what that does is raise property values. And if you're an owner, that's a good thing. If you're a renter, it's a different story. And so gentrification has been the hottest topic in the past couple of years. Gentrification has a vocabulary, it has a geography, and it has a cityscape of, like here, Faubourg wines, the funky bicycle, the sort of aesthetics of grittiness, even as they become wealthier areas. You'll notice over here, fine dining for the people, except that the people can't afford to dine there. And probably most ironically, the back-of-town coffee. And you'll see reflected in the window there is the last of the old Iberville housing projects. I'll wrap up there. Thank you.